Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, and may I at the outset extend my welcome to colleagues at the beginning of a new parliamentary year. I have a confession to make. I wish that it was every day in this place that I had the opportunity to rise to speak on a bill entitled Statute Update Smaller Government Bill 2013. That would be a great thing, but today is a good day because it is one rare day that I get to speak on a bill so well titled and so well motivated in its intentions. And I'll get to the specific aspects of the bill in a moment. This is a bill actually we started debating late last year before we broke for Christmas. And I remember sitting in the chamber listening to the speech that Senator Whish-Wilson has just concluded earlier today on this, and I was reflecting very carefully over the Christmas break on that speech and its many and varied aspects, and I wanted to respond to some of them. Senator Whish-Wilson focused particularly on one of the advisory bodies that is going to be abolished by this bill and his concern that it would lead to problems for the Australian environment. Senator Whish-Wilson spoke about the many and varied forms of waste that concern him, including, if my memory serves me correctly, e-waste, plastic waste, food waste, probably other forms of waste. But in listening very carefully to Senator Whish-Wilson's contribution last year and his continuation today, there is one form of waste which he didn't mention, and it's a form of waste that I think that us as parliamentarians, as stewards of the Australian people's money, should be very careful about, and that is of course the waste of taxpayers' money, and that's actually what this bill seeks to address and does address. The truth is that much of the money which taxpayers work hard to earn and pay here to the federal government is not always as well spent as it could be, and any opportunity we have to make sure that that money is spent better and if there's any left over, returned to the people it comes from in the first place through lower taxes, is something that we should all strive to do. I think the waste of taxpayers' money is the greatest waste in this country and something that we should be all mindful of. Senator Bernardi certainly knows the way to my heart by very kindly and extensively quoting from the great work of the Institute of Public Affairs, which, as senators know, is a former employer of mine, and in particular their work in recent years on red tape, which is a vital issue facing the nation. As the IPA has demonstrated and as Senator Bernardi quoted, red tape costs the Australian economy $176 billion a year, and our GDP would be about 11% higher if there were no red tape barriers to economic growth. Senator Bernardi is right in one very important respect, which is to say that the task of reducing red tape is never over. The task of combating red tape will never end. As long as there is a parliament, as long as there is a bureaucracy, as long as there are legislators, there will be a need to combat the rising tide of red tape. I think Senator Bernardi is being a little bit unfair, though, to the record of this government on red tape, and particularly I note his reference to the IPA's annual research on the pages of legislation passed by the parliament, which is actually a piece of research that I had some involvement in back in my time at the IPA. And it is one very good measure of red tape, and it is a measure which actually reflects favourably on this coalition government compared to the Labor government that preceded it. As I think Senator Bernardi was able to acknowledge, we have passed far fewer pages of new legislation than previous governments, and we have done more to repeal legislation than previous governments. But it is of course a lament of all modern governments that there is so much regulation and so much legislation that is required to be passed, and there's so much demand in the community for us to act on issues of concern, and often the first call when addressing a problem in society is a call to government asking us to regulate. And I think that is a flawed approach, and that wherever possible we should decline to do so. Because one of the things this government and other governments who've attempted to reduce red tape have discovered is that it's much more difficult to remove red tape than it is to put it there in the first place. Every time a new law is passed, every time a new regulation is put in place, up arises around it a constituency to defend it. So even some of what I would characterise as the more modest measures in this bill, which really should be uncontroversial, are attracting some opposition. I will politely suggest that most Australians haven't heard of the Oil Stewardship Advisory Council or indeed the Development Allowance Authority, and yet there will be objections from some that these bodies will no longer go on to exist. I would respectfully suggest that if all of these bodies were abolished, that the only people that would notice tomorrow, as opposed to today, that they weren't there anymore, are anyone who was serving on them or being paid by them, but not anyone else in the wider community. One of my pleasures in this parliament is to serve on the Red Tape Committee being chaired by Senator David Leydenham, who's speaking next in this debate. And it's confronted many interesting issues in red tape and regulation. We've gone sector by sector and looked at regulation in all sorts of different areas, from alcohol taxation to this Friday having a hearing on regulation in the health industry and health services. And as interesting as each of those individual sessions has been into individual industries and sectors, where we've learnt about the perhaps unintended consequences and inefficient barriers that red tape causes for them in their industry and prevents them from employing more people or better providing services to their consumers, or better returns indeed to their shareholders. I think what's more interesting is the holistic findings that will come out of this inquiry process, and hopefully the holistic recommendations that we can make at the end of this process, because I think we're confronting two truths. One is, in the modern world, the declining trust in institutions, particularly the declining trust in companies, has led consumers and voters to demand a higher level of regulation of those companies. Whereas they once may have been willing to trust their bank manager because they knew him walking down the street and had a good personal relationship with him, now they think of a bank as an impersonal institution far away from what they do in their lives and that doesn't relate to them. And so they demand from us much greater regulation and much greater oversight on the activities of a bank that they no longer trust to do as they would once have done. And that's why in areas of food safety and in the environment and whole lots of other areas, there is a greater demand for regulation on businesses. And that obviously has very severe impacts, as the IPA has very well documented. Countering that phenomenon is going to be a very broad issue for us to solve. It's not going to be solved simply by walking in here and repealing any one act or bill, or by trimming back any existing regulation. It's a much broader societal issue for us to confront. The second is the one I referred to earlier, which is that constituencies arise around red tape and regulation, and those who benefit from it seek to defend it when governments seek to remove it. And so the efforts that this government has encountered in trying to repeal red tape has been that, amazingly, some businesses, certainly many public servants, unions and others, get really attached to regulation once it's in place, and fight very hard to ensure it is not removed, and are utterly convinced that their very existence would not continue without that law or regulation in place. So what that lesson, I think, teaches us very importantly, is that we should be even more careful before we put a piece of regulation in place, because once we put it in place, by and large, I think it's going to stay there. It's going to be very difficult to remove. So I think we need to look at mechanisms to ensure that the build-up of red tape and regulation doesn't happen in the first place, as much as it is important for us to look at repealing regulation that is already there. I want to now outline some of the key aspects of the bill. It's, of course, part of the government's smaller government agenda, and it follows on from decisions the government has made to abolish a number of bodies that have been previously announced. It will cease or abolish 7 government bodies, and there are 2 in particular that I want to single out for consideration of the Senate in demonstration of why this bill is necessary. The first is the Central Trades Committee. This sounds like something from another era, and indeed it is. It sounds like something that perhaps Senator Rhiannon would have served on in her time in the Soviet Union. It's a bizarre anachronism that these sorts of bodies arise, in this case as a result of an act in 1946 to recognise the trade skills gained by Australians during World War II. It has jurisdiction for a whole range of industries, including blacksmithing, which I must confess, I'm no doubt going to get some angry emails from the many blacksmiths out there, but I didn't think was a very big employer in modern 21st century Australia, needing of special regulation by a particular committee of the federal government. But there are some who would argue that indeed it is, and that abolishing this will have a terrible impact on the, no doubt, thousands of people that are employed as blacksmiths. I know that our former colleague here, Senator Madigan, was a blacksmith, but I seem to remember it was notable that there were any blacksmiths left at all, him included. So somehow I think if the Central Trades Committee is abolished, that the nation will go on, that people will rise out of their beds in the morning and go to work as blacksmiths, boilermakers, sheet metal operators or boot trades. Again, probably not a really big employer in modern 21st century Australia, even without this very important committee. The other, of course, is the Plant Breeders' Rights Advisory Committee, and again, I hate to earn the wrath of plant breeders out there in Australia, but I have such great faith in their own ability to advocate for them that I don't think we need a special federal government committee established to do it. And I guess that brings me to a more wider point about advisory committees and advocacy to government. I think wherever possible, there certainly is a role for advisory committees in some specialist areas perhaps, but wherever possible, we should rely on civil society to advocate for itself. We shouldn't have government appointing advocates of civil society on behalf of civil society, and we certainly shouldn't be employing them or putting them on committees, because that really fundamentally undermines their core responsibility, which is to advocate for their own constituency. It is not our job to employ people to be advocates on behalf of their own sector or their own industry. There are an infinite number of very good NGOs and charities and peak bodies here in Canberra and elsewhere in Australia that are very articulate advocates for their industry or their area of interest, that are very effective at making their case to government when need be. And I think the process of us appointing them to our bodies doesn't assist them in that. I'd much rather see them do that on their own. Finally, I want to turn to some objections that have been raised by Labor senators in this debate, particularly about the Corporation and Markets Advisory Committee. I think it's worth noting, of course, that the financial services industry is one of Australia's strongest industry sectors and really is not in the need of sponsorship from taxpayers. I wouldn't have thought that Labor senators would agree that we need to pay the financial services industry to lobby for government. I didn't think that they were in favour of subsidies to big banks and other financial institutions, but perhaps I have a misapprehension there, which will be corrected further in this debate. The industry is obviously very professional, very influential, very capable of putting its views to government, and there are dozens of private organisations that do this. It doesn't need a government committee to do so. It obviously faces a diversity of issues, and the different views among its stakeholders are needed for policy input to government. One single panel cannot ever hope to capture all that diversity, all that different point of view based on where they come from. Since it was abolished, we have received very rich input from the finance industry, including on reforms related to managed investment schemes, crowdsourced equity funding, external dispute resolution, mutuals, cooperatives and member-owned firms. There's a lot of exciting things happening in this space, and of course open banking, just to name a few areas. I mentioned Senator Whish-Wilson's objections to the abolition of the Product Stewardship Advisory Group. Originally, of course, this body had a role in the early stages of a new legislative scheme, but given that the Act is now well established with several years of operation, it's probably not necessary to have the committee continue. The Department of Environment and Energy now engages with industry experts on an as-needs basis to gather advice on the classes of products to be considered for some form of accreditation and regulation. This is obviously a far more flexible and effective way to engage with industry, to get the right people at the right time, at the least cost to taxpayers, unlike a standing body that has an inflexible composition and fixed overheads, regardless of the need of the government to consult it and seek its advice. This more efficient approach to consultations means that we can get much more diverse input to our decision-making from people who are highly engaged and effective because they are from the appropriate industry or science field. So it is not as if we are no longer seeking consultation, seeking advice, we're just doing it in different ways. Not everything requires an ongoing standing committee. The 2016-17 product list, for example, was compiled under this kind of consultation, and it includes products such as end-of-life batteries, photovoltaic systems, plastic oil containers, and of course microbeads, which I know is an issue very close to the heart of Senator Whish-Wilson, being a surfer. This bill, if it were enacted, would repeal 3 acts and amend 10 acts across the Commonwealth to support the implementation of the government's smaller government agenda. It is the core business of what governments do to focus on the really important things that we do and to do away with some of the more peripheral things that we do that aren't as important, aren't as vital. We should only be doing here what no one else can do. If it can be done else by civil society, by private enterprise, by volunteers, then we should not be replicating it here. We should not be crowding out individual citizens who seek to do that on their own. and we should seek any opportunity to reduce our expenditure, to reduce our waste, so that we can do the very moral thing, which is to return to people the money that they've earned themselves. It is profoundly wrong for us to take more from taxpayers, any more than we absolutely need to do the things that only we can do, and spend it in an unwise and undisciplined way. And that's why I commend this bill to the Senate.